Hi and welcome to Tengy Reviews The Twilight Zone. I'm Tengy and today's episode is the classic Time Enough at Last. Time Enough at Last was written by Rod Serling based on a short story by Lynn Venable. It was directed by Brahm. The plot: bookworm Henry Bemis just wants to read, but his job and his mean wife won't let him. When he finds himself the only survivor after an H-bomb devastates the world, Bemis realizes he now has all the time and solitude he wants to do what he loves, or so he thinks. Points of interest in this story. This bank set looks so familiar, and I'm sure we're going to see it again in other Twilight Zone episodes. Burgess Meredith is only 52 here, only a couple of years older than me. I always thought he was older in this. Rod Serling's opening narration here sets up an irresistible premise. In only a few short lines, he manages to encapsulate so much about his protagonist, Mr. Bemis, a dreamer with a passion for literature and the world he lives in, governed by the demands of work and business, a world that is hostile to such dreamers and what they hold dear. The kicker in this prologue, of course, is in its foreshadowing of what is to come, that Mr. Bemis is about to find himself in a world with no other people to stop him doing what he loves. 3 sentences are all Serling needs to establish this explosive premise. Astonishing. It would be almost impossible, I think, to watch and hear this intro and not be hooked into the story. This episode really confronts how dehumanizing so many jobs can be. When the boss is telling Bemis off, he tells him he doesn't function properly in the organization and that he should get back to his cage. There is no room for a personality, for interests, or for loving things in this world. Bemis is expected to be a functionary, an anonymous component within a larger machine, and nothing more. I think many of us would find this all too relatable. Having said that, Bemis can't switch off his love of reading. He actually is a bad employee in that he doesn't focus on his job at the bank at all. But what this made me think about was the notion that we have to switch off our authentic selves much of the time at work. This is what is required. Is Bemis a bad person because he can't put on this mask? Or is he just being true to himself and the things he loves? The complicating factor here, though, is that Bemis can't be himself at home either, as his wife doesn't accept his love of reading and won't let him read. Bemis is trapped by social institutions in every direction. There's just no space for him to be himself at all, and no escape. Nice moments of humour here, as well as poignancy. The story does engage comedic tropes like the henpecked husband and the nagging wife, but underlying the funny one-liners, there is a real sense that his wife actually despises him. There's real hostility here and contempt, and on Bemis's part, there's real sadness. Bemis actually seems afraid of his wife. The intent seems to be comedic, but there is a more disturbing edge to this. And if the roles were reversed, I think most people would see this as a borderline abusive relationship. Helen is actually pretty sadistic, smiling while she destroys the book of poetry that she's already defaced. Now, it's easy to forget that divorce was not easy to get at this time. It was frowned on for social and religious reasons. So Bemis is actually trapped in marriage as much as he's trapped in his job. Another of Serling's characters who's trapped in a system in which they can't win and from which they can't escape. The newspaper headline here reminds us of the Cold War simmering away under the surface at this point in history. And what struck me about this was also the threat of total annihilation makes the misery of wasting your life in a job you hate seem all the more terrible and futile. Now, this sequence with the newspaper, the book, and the watch is something quite extraordinary. In the space of about 10 seconds, Serling and Brahm pull the rug out from under the viewer to the most startling effect. Something shocking and incomprehensible is happening, and it's as much of a shock to us as it is to Bemis. Bemis lives so much in his head, he hasn't even noticed that the H-bomb threat is front page news. It's only when the bank vault begins to shake that we realise that Armageddon is taking place in the world outside of Bemis's safe haven. The initial shattering of the clock's glass, I think, also foreshadows what's going to happen to Bemis's glasses at the end. There's always this sense of vulnerability around Bemis's glasses throughout the episode. Brilliant use of subjective camera here as we see through Bemis's eyes when he emerges to find the wrecked bank. He puts on his glasses and the shot comes into focus, revealing horrific devastation. The shift in tone in the middle section from the comedic elements to suddenly confronting the viewer with the reality of global annihilation is jaw-dropping, audacious, a genuinely stunning change of gears that twists us right off our feet. This is a plunge into the abyss of humanity's worst fears and most self-destructive impulses. And Bemis, so small, vulnerable and sensitive and endearing, is the one who is forced to confront this alone. Hearing his boss's recorded voice as we see his dead hand on the floor seems again to highlight how absurd the boss's self-important obsession with business over humanity was in the face of these bigger issues of life and death. And we have to wonder what his boss has missed out on as a human being while being so fixated on status and numbers, finance. All of that couldn't protect him from dying just like everybody else. Serling's unusual middle narration and this whole sequence of Bemis in the devastated world are really harrowing, like Bemis has descended into hell in some Dante-esque odyssey. In Serling's words, the earth has been reduced to a graveyard. This is strong stuff, and the visuals are incredibly bleak and nightmarish. But the irony is, of course, now Bemis has the space to be himself. He talks to himself openly, expressing his deepest thoughts. "I'm not at all sure I want to be alive," he says. And the subject of suicide comes up again when Bemis finds a gun. This story has a lot in common with the film On the Beach, which came out later this same year. And in my review of that film, I pointed out that a story about nuclear apocalypse is necessarily also a film about suicide, because it's about humanity willfully destroying itself. Not surprising then that the same themes emerge here at this same moment in history. The steps of the public library were also featured in the 1960 film of The Time Machine. Now, the giant clock Bemis finds on the library steps when he gives his "Time Enough at Last" speech seems to echo the clock that shattered in the vault, but this time it's his glasses that shatter. Once again, Brahm brilliantly uses subjective camera here to show Bemis's eyesight switch back to being out of focus. As a side note, I always think if Bemis found books and food still intact, he might find an optometrist shop and some usable glasses somewhere. I like to think he might, because the alternative is just too devastating. And in the end, Serling tells us Henry Bemis is just another bit of smashed rubble in the landscape that man has deeded to himself. Bemis is as broken as his glasses. This ending is as shattering, I think, as any depicted in the series. The cast and crew. Director John Brahm made a lot of movies, but also about 150 TV films and episodes, including Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Among his movies, though, was The Mad Magician starring Vincent Price. Burgess Meredith's career is well worth looking up online. I think people of my generation know him best from his later work in Batman, Rocky, Day of the Locust, etc. But if you get a chance, seek out some of his earlier work, because he had a whole career as a young man that I think is often overlooked. Check him out in the Ginger Rogers romantic comedy Tom, Dick and Harry. He is absolutely adorable in that and super cute as a young man. He would go on to appear in 4 Twilight Zone episodes, and I think his personal warmth and appeal are so much a part of what makes this episode work as brilliantly as it does. Jacqueline deWit, who played Helen, had a solid career as a character actress in film and TV, even appearing in Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound. Vaughn Taylor as bank boss Mr. Carsville appeared in 5 Twilight Zone episodes, as well as countless films and TV shows. He's yet another Twilight Zone star who appeared in Psycho. It's hard to believe there are only 3 credited actors in this story because it feels so much bigger in scope than that. To sum up, this story confronts us with the weightiest of questions. What is all of humanity striving for? What is the sum of all our knowledge worth if we are only going to destroy ourselves? No one will be able to read these great cultural works then. Ultimately, this is a story about the war within us between the creative urge and the destructive urge. Books versus bombs, if you will. It's a story about the best and worst of our own potential as humans. Bemis loves the best in us, the culture, the creativity, but the system he lives in won't allow him to connect with that as he wants to, because it's not what the system values. Even after everything is in ruins, Bemis still wants to focus on this, but in the end he can't. He's literally prevented from seeing it anymore. It's about the ways in which we dehumanize each other when we give in to the worst of human impulses, as his boss and his wife do on the small scale, trying to control and dominate. Now, I once showed this episode to my granddad, who had never watched Twilight Zone before. Like Bemis, he was a bookworm who loved books, and I thought that he would appreciate the masterful storytelling in this, the unique fantasy dimensions of it, but he actually found it really upsetting. Looking back at it now, I can completely understand why. Because this is also a story about how we put off doing what we love because of our obligations, the things society demands of us. And we all aim to do these things later when we have time, but as the story painfully reminds us, there might not be a later. And in the meantime, we've been putting our real selves to one side in service of something we actually don't want to do, and which often does not allow us to express our true natures or to reach our potential or feel fulfilled. These ideas are as stark and confronting as the landscape in the end of this show. Offhand, I can't think of another half hour of TV drama that takes us on such a devastating journey. And the beating, bleeding heart at the centre of this is Burgess Meredith's performance. His own lovable qualities make this all the more painful and poignant. From the premise to the script, the direction, performances, even the art direction, this episode is exemplary in every way and one of the greatest examples of the unique and lasting impact that the Twilight Zone at its best could have. No one who sees this story forgets it in a hurry. It lingers in your mind. It leaves a mark. There are many great Twilight Zone episodes, but this is one of the truly outstanding ones for me. If you have thoughts about this story, I would love to hear them in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video today, you can support this channel by liking and subscribing. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you'll join me next time when we move on to Perchance to Dream. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.